Hello, friends and watchers all. This is Big John again, coming to you from Fitzmaurice Castle in the heart of New Orleans. I received a number of positive responses to my last video shedding light on the timeline of Mardi Gras in New Orleans and the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I am not going to let all those positive comments go to my head that much, but I feel the need to address yet another pile of misinformation, which is as noisome as the gutters of Bourbon Street before the street sweepers go to work. Each time our community, our state, our nation, or our world experiences a natural disaster of epic proportions, many start looking toward the ethereal and or supernatural for an explanation. And there are those who are always ready to offer an explanation, chief among whom are those who impose the belief that God somehow employs disasters like this either to punish transgression or as a means to draw humanity's attention to the divine glory. Innocent children shot by crazed madmen in the schools? God allowed it to happen because secular society removed prayer from public schools. Natural disasters or pandemics wreak havoc on the population must be because of grievous sins, regardless of whether the afflicted themselves were the perpetrators of those sins. The late Jerry Falwell Sr., who now seems mild compared to his son, once preached with many others that 9/11 was punishment on our nation for immorality. Another so-called spiritual advisor who occasionally has the ear of those in the White House recently remarked that COVID-19 was God's punishment for homosexuality. Franklin Graham, whose father's righteousness and decency did not apparently rub off on his son, just came out with a commercial calling for everyone to turn back to God, which I am sure involves some form of monetary donation. Megachurch pastors are still being irresponsible during this crisis and calling for people to fill their pews and thus the collection baskets, because God will act as a shield for them against the pandemic. Once again, I can speak only for myself. Other than to teach parish religion classes, I have not employed my religious training for many years. Furthermore, I am not a cleric and shall leave the homiletics to those more qualified in that field, like my good friends the Dominicans and the Jesuits, the various Protestant priests and ministers I have had the pleasure of befriending, and the leaders of other great religious traditions for whom I have respect. But I believe in a basic universal truth about God who created us all, and that is the divine nature is one of love, mercy, and an unvarying desire for us to come back. Furthermore, the greatest gift God has bestowed on humanity is the ability to use our reason. And reason is something we really need to exercise right now. There are those who employ the Old Testament to argue God can at times be vengeful and prone to fits of wrath. The plagues against the Egyptians, the frequent subjugation of Israel to the enemy tribes throughout the book of Judges, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by Babylon are cited by those calling themselves Christians, that God is somehow keeping a quote-unquote account book of our transgressions and only wipes them away when we make the proper penance. Perhaps the most notable expression of this view of God is found in the first chapter of the book of the prophet Nahum, in which the prophet writes, "A jealous and avenging God is the Lord, an avenger is the Lord, full of wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries." That's quite a nasty God there. Even my friends who are atheists love to cite the Old Testament perception of the deity to ask, how could I possibly believe in God whose behavior resembles Zeus or Odin? Of course, this is an early view of God in the Old Testament. After the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE and the deportation of the people of Judah to Babylon, the period known as the exile, the Hebrew understanding of God changed. God was no longer a primary God. God was a singular God. Interestingly enough, the entire world changed its view of the eternal around the same time. In Persia, Zoroaster began writing of a singular God. In Greece, Thales of Miletus began the study of philosophy. In China, Master Kongzi began his 100 schools of thought that became what we call Confucianism, and Lao Tzu emphasized the need to live in harmony with the Tao. And in India, Mahavira established Jainism as a way to truth and release, while a man named Siddhartha Gautama began his path toward becoming the Buddha. Half a millennia later, at the beginning of the Common Era, Christ came along and spread this basic message. God is not vengeful. God is not retributive. God is a loving, intimate parent who wants us to return home, who welcomes us when we do return home, whose two main characteristics are love and mercy. God is the father of the prodigal son, who exacts no vengeance or punishment, but welcomes us home instead with a great feast. That is the God of the New Testament, and that is the God in which I believe. But if one wants to stubbornly adhere to the Old Testament, then let me recommend to you all the book of Job, or as I like to subtitle it, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. Written somewhere around the 6th century before the Common Era, that is right around the time or after the exile, the book is a series of poetic debates about the nature of suffering and the problem of divine justice. The central event of the book is chapters 38 through 42, in which God finally addresses Job. In summary, the entire point of God's message is that suffering is part of what is known as the creation package. Innocence or guilt is not part of the equation. Suffering just is, and it is up to us as to how we deal with it. We can be juvenile like the three friends of Job and believe God is a divine punisher, or we can believe, like Job, that God is filled with justice and mercy and is with us the entire time. And in all this, there is something else that we need to consider, something that the so-called Reverends Falwell and Graham and those like them either fail to consider or are afraid for their followers to consider. Whether one adheres to the teachings of Christ or the Torah and the Talmud or the Sutras or the Quran or the Vedas or the Agamas or the Avesta or whatever sacred scriptures there are, there is an orientation in all of them toward God, who transcends all our religious expressions. And if none of those paths work for you, then, as my little brother often has said, find your higher power, whatever it may be, and let that higher power inspire you to love and mercy and hope. I do not look for God in viruses or pandemics or disasters of any sort. I look for God in the heroic efforts of doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals, law enforcement, first responders, grocery clerks, pharmacists, truck drivers keeping us supplied, and all those out there doing their jobs despite the danger. I see God in the reporters who are honestly attempting to keep us informed throughout this crisis, often putting themselves at risk. I see God in those who are staying at home and not putting others at risk despite the inconvenience. I see God in the actions of Captain Brett Crozier, who risked his own command and possibly his career to save his sailors. I see God in the teachings of Pope Francis, who recently said, "There's also the fears of each one of us. Each one knows what their own fears are. We pray to the Lord that he might help us to trust and to tolerate and conquer those fears." I see God in the actions of the Dalai Lama, who made a significant contribution to the Indian state in which he has lived in exile for the past 6 decades. I believe in the God that even inspired Imam Omar Ricci, who said, "Thank God for this reminder that we should be grateful for all things, for groceries, toilet paper, good health. Thank God for reminding us life is fragile, and we had best be appreciative of the miracle and blessing that God has given us in creating us as souls." Expecting God to come riding down to our rescue like a knight on a horse with spear and shield is contrary to our reason. Relying on God to inspire us to do good for others and see the good in all those helping at this time is what will, in my own opinion, carry us through this terrible ordeal. Like the 67th chapter of the Quran, verse 2 states, "He who created death and life to test you as to which of you is better in conduct, he is the Almighty, the forgiving." Seeing God as something that delights in our suffering and punishes the most vulnerable borders on the blasphemous. Seeing God who suffers with us is the sanctified view of the Almighty. So let us remember the words of the Talmud, that while the gates of most of our churches are locked, the gates of our tears are not locked, and God is always ready to accept our tears and suffer with us. Thank you. Take care. God bless.